Good morning, everybody. So I've been meaning to do some colouring videos for a while now, but life has been taking over. I've been busy packing lots of orders. Thank you so much to everybody that's placed an order, and also dealing with new releases and Hachanda show preparation and so on. Not to mention the kind of normal homeschooling and Alpaca farm and so on. It's busy times, but I've got a few minutes now, so I just thought I'd show you how I would go about colouring an image. I'm not a colourist, I'm not a professional colourist, I just have practiced and come up with a way that I find that I like, that isn't too time consuming. You know, you could spend hours and hours colouring images and that's nice, but I personally don't have the time to do that. So I've come up with different ways that I like to colour images that's perhaps a bit quicker. But I'm, like I say, I'm not a professional colourist. What I am going to show you is just my personal preference of how I like to colour an image. If you can take something from it, great. But I would urge you to watch all the amazing colourists out there. They've got lots of videos and different things to show you how they work. So please do watch those. But I'm just going to take you through how I would go about colouring this image. So I'm going to use... I do use Copics, and I do use Zig clean colour brush markers. I also use Derwent Intense pencils, lots of different colouring mediums, but today I'm going to show you how I use distress markers for my colouring, and it's really quick and simple. So I've just picked out some colours. You could equally use the ink pads and just smush them onto a glass mat or a palette or whatever. I've actually just got the markers just because it's easy just to scribble them down and then use them from there. So I've got here pumice stone, which I've just scribbled on the mat there. I've got hickory smoke, which I'm going to scribble on there too. I've also got shaded lilac. I've got some worn lipstick, and also some peeled paint. So just scribble all those down. The other thing that I've got here is a piece of kitchen towel and also some water. So all I'm going to start by doing is just making my brush fairly wet, just dabbing it off on the kitchen paper a little bit, and I'm just going to pick up some of the, I don't know if you can see that actually, let's just move that upwards a bit. So I'm just going to take some of the grey, and I'm just literally going to go in and start around the edges to begin with. Make sure your brush is fairly wet but not drenched, and then I'm just literally adding a base layer of pumice stone, which is the lightest colour. Now I just want to also just touch on the cardstock that I'm using. I'm using Bockingford Hot Press watercolour card, which is, in my opinion, the best out there, the best that I've come across anyway. And it's really important, you know, people say, oh, I'm not having great results and different things like that, and then it might be that they're using a really kind of either an inexpensive watercolour card, or it might not even be watercolour card, and it doesn't enable you to blend in the same way as a good watercolour card does. So I really recommend this Bockingford. If you want the texture, then the cold press is great. If you want a nice smooth surface, then the hot press. I use both. For this one, obviously, I'm using the hot press. So I'm just literally just popping a whole layer down. And you'll notice I'm almost doing the whole, I'm doing as much of the image as I want to for this point. So I keep, each time I get water on my brush before I pick up the colour. So if you try with a dry brush, you're just going to get patchy results, and it's not going to soak into the paper nicely. So for the moment, all you want is just some coverage. You'll notice that I've left this part of the elephant's face slightly lighter. That's okay, that's just because I intend the light to be there, but you could colour it all at this point. It's not really an issue. The other thing I want to say about this is I've actually used VersaFine to stamp the image, and then I've heat embossed it using clear embossing powder, just because I find it helps you to keep in the lines. It means that you haven't got any risk of the outline bleeding, perhaps if you've not dried it enough, or it's still slightly damp or whatever. So I would heat emboss all of mine. I just think it adds an extra, it's a sharpness to the image. So that I think is really important too. I'm just going to put some more of that down. I use quite a lot. The other thing is the colouring mediums. I think that if you use cheaper versions of, you know, watercolour pencils or whatever it might be, you might not get the same results as if you use a quality brand. So my advice would always be go for the best quality that you can afford, and you're likely to get the best results. So not always the case, but certainly in my opinion, that's the way it's been for me. So another tip that I would suggest, and something that I've sort of learnt just by practicing, is that you really need to give each layer a time to dry in between. If you dab off at this point with kitchen roll or whatever, you're going to take all that colour out. If you wait for it to dry and then add some more ink over the top, then you're creating layers. So you're actually creating, it's easier to create the shading because you've let it dry in between and you're adding another layer of colour on top. It will blend into what's underneath, because that's the nature of the distress inks, the watercolours and so on. It does reactivate them, but by letting each layer dry, you're then building it up more. So I think the face is pretty much dry there. Now you can either go in with the same colour, and I'll show you what that does. So this is the same colour I've just used, but I'm just building up. And in terms of where you put your shadow, it's personal preference. I like to imagine that the light is coming from a certain place. So in this instance, I'm kind of envisaging the sun or light is coming from this direction, in which case everything on this side of the image would be darker, and also where parts create shadow. So for example, on this one, the head would create shadow on the ear. So you can just pop that in. Now you can see there, the line that I've created there is not very smooth. So just dab off the paint, go in with your water and just blend it out. Now, don't worry if you create at this point like a watermark. It's always salvage. Well, I say always. Most of the time you can salvage it. And don't worry, because it's just a piece of paper at the end of the day. So if you go wrong, that's fine. Just experiment. That's, you know, the number of images that I've thought, oh, I'm not really happy with that. So I've either continued and it's come right, or I've thought, no, that's just not right, and I've just left it and stamped again. So just build up those layers, just a little bit at a time. So I'm just going to go in around there because that would be shaded. Always dab off in the water and onto your kitchen roll. And again, this would be darker here because the sun's coming from this way, so it would just, the highlight would be on the tip of the ear. And you can add in as much colour. The more layers you do, I mean, you don't want to do too many layers, because what might start to happen, especially if you've not got good quality card, is the card would start to pill, and some of the top layer of the paper would come off. So you don't want to do that. That's what happens if you put too much water on and work it too much. This is a good quality card, so I've never actually had that issue. But you can see here, I've put too much water in here, and it's taken most of the colour out. So let it dry and then go back in. This side here, I've created watermarks. That's fine. Let it dry and you can go back in. I'm quite happy with how the face looks. If you want to add more colour, you can do. If I just lift that up, let's have a look. So let's just, you can see there it's created a nice shadow here. So I'm quite happy with the face. I may go in again once it's dry, but for the moment I'm just going to keep going. So shade underneath the neck there. And again, if the light's coming from this way, this side would be darker. Of course, your shadow can be coming from wherever you want it to. there's no right or wrong. Just have a play around with it, see what you think looks best. This is just the way I choose to do it. Like I say, I'm not an expert, so I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that will be shouting at the screen and saying, no, that's not how you do it. But I just find this is the way I do it. And I'm fairly happy with the results. Obviously, I could, if I had lots of time to practice, I could become better and better. But for the moment, this works for me. And then, so this arm is dry. So again, I can go back in. So again, the highlight would be at the top of the arm there. If you want to just blend in that edge, just make sure your brush is just slightly damp and then go in and just blend it out. And then what I'm going to do is go back into those ears, because I've really kind of left those, put too much water on. So dab off a bit of the extra water, and I'm just going to go in again with the same colour. And I'm just going to blend that out. Okay. Most of that ear would actually be in the shade anyway, I guess, from his head. So let's just blend that out. Okay. Now, if you don't like the kind of watercolory effects, sort of slightly patchy, because you can see the lines here, you can see the lines on the tummy. Well, let's get that in the right place. So the lines on the tummy here, you can actually see those lines. I actually quite like that. Some people wouldn't. You might want to blend it out, put another layer of colour on. The other thing you can do, obviously, is add a different colour or a darker colour. Now, the rule of thumb with things like your alcohol markers is pick at least 3 different shades of the colour in order to get a nice blend and a nice level of shading, I guess. I don't find you need to do that with watercolour, simply because you can layer up with the same colour. However, it does add a different dimension if you add a different colour in. So I'm going to go in now with the Hickory Smoke, which is the slightly darker. It's actually a bluier kind of grey, but it's darker. So I'm just going to go in here where this would be quite dark because it's in the shadow from his tummy. I'm just going to put that darker colour in, and I'm also going to just pop that darker colour in the shadow round his body there as well. And obviously the trunk would be creating a shadow. And then I'm going to do the same. So this, again, the slightly darker grey, and I'm just going to go into this area. And then I'm taking all the colour off, making sure my brush is just slightly damp, and I'm just going into the edges there. Again, darker grey. Just there, dab off the colour, make sure that your brush isn't too wet, and go back in. And then obviously, in order to make sure it's uniform across the whole image, I'm going to go onto the head there as well. Now, if you go in before an area is dry, quite often it will just bleach a lot of that colour out. So again, that's a good reason. Let it dry first. I've gone in too quickly here, and it's not actually had much of an effect on that ear. And then I'm just going to go just here, just to make sure it's uniform. Okay, then what I'm going to do, actually, I just want to create a bit more. If you go round the head like this, then you get that rounded, you know, it looks like the head's rounded. If you stop up here like I had done before, it doesn't look so round, so it just adds to the cute factor, the rounder it is there. I'm just going to go back in there. So you can keep playing with it, as long as you're dabbing off onto your kitchen roll. I don't know if you can actually see I'm just literally dabbing it off onto the kitchen roll there, just to make sure that my brush isn't too wet. What I also do with my images all the time is I make sure that they have rosy cheeks. So I've just got a bit of the worn lipstick, and I'm just going to water it down on the mat to start with, just to make sure it's not too bright, because we don't want it looking like, you know, like it's got blusher on. And then I'm just going to drop that into the cheeks there. And then again, you can just you can go in for a second there. I'm just using an almost dry brush just to sort of blot that out a little bit. If you think to yourself, oh, I've gone over the edge, or I've put too much ink on, all you can do, so I've gone over the edge there, so I just wet it, and then just take your kitchen roll or your tissue and just blot it away. So watercolour is actually really forgiving. It's really quick, really easy, and really forgiving. So I don't like the way I've created a watermark just here on his body. So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to scribble some more of this colour down actually first. Let's go brush end. And here, this is darker. I'm just going to make sure that's totally dry before I go in again, because at the moment it's not dry. I think the ear is almost dry. So what I'm going to do while I'm waiting for those bits to dry so that I can go back in again, I'm actually going to do the boots. So I'm going to use the shaded lilac for the boots. So again, I'm just going to take the colour, and what I tend to do is wherever the darker part would be, so in this case it would be on the bottom of the boot because if the sun's coming this way, and it would also be just here where there's a little bit of shadow from the foot there. So those are the darker areas, so I always go in, when I've got fresh colour on my brush, I go into those areas first, and then you can just use a damp brush, you see, just to pull out that colour. So you can see there's already an element of shading there. And then the same on this one, so darker at the bottom there, slightly darker there, and then just literally wet your brush, dab it off on the kitchen roll so it's not too wet, and just blend it out like that. Okay, that's not going to be perfect. I'm going to just go back in with the colour again and just blend. It doesn't matter if it's not perfect the first time because you can go in with another layer. So now that I've got the base layer on the boots there, I'm going to just go back in to the ear first of all. So I'm taking the darker grey, the hickory smoke, and I'm just going up against the head there, just to add the darker in, and then I'm just going to tap off the excess water and just blend that out. And again, under the chin there, I'm going to go in with the darker grey. I'm just going to pop the colour on there like that, and then wash my brush, wash all the colour off, dab most of the water off, and then just blend around the edges there. To make that work, I'm going to go back in here. Okay, and then I'm not really sure how I think the rosy cheeks are a bit too far up there, so I'm just going to take a damp brush there, and I'm just going to use my kitchen roll just to go in and just take a bit of that colour away. And I'm going to use the hickory smoke just to take the blush cheek and just kind of blend it in a little bit. So that's got a little bit of grey on the brush. I'm just going around the edge there just to kind of blend that in. His arm, I think, is not defined enough, so I'm going to go back in with the grey again and just make that slightly darker. I've gone over the edge there, so we'll just take the wet brush and just dab it off there. And then what I'm going to do, actually I'm going to use some Blueprint Sketch. That goes really well with the shaded lilac for some darker areas. So I'm just going to use a bit of that and go in on his boots. Okay, actually I'm just not, let's go back in a little bit with the grey in there. See, I've gone in lots of times with the layers of paint, or the layers of colour I should say, on this image, and my paper is handling it all beautifully. There's no kind of you know, nowhere where it's really ruined the paper or created any kind of pilling or anything. So I'm happy with how this is coming along. Like I say, if you don't like the watercolour look that's kind of slightly patchy, then by all means blend it out a little bit more, but I like that. I think it's looking good. So then all I would do is go in with some green. So what I'm going to do first with this is I'm going to put water down first. So just straight water onto the paper, so that, make sure we get a good amount on there, so that when I go in with my green, it just spreads and it gives you a nice grass. You can see it's kind of fading out there in the water. So that's a nice light colour. And then when that's dried, I'm going to go back in. I'm just going to go back in and put a darker shadow where his foot is. So I think what I'm just going to show you first of all is how I just finish off the image. So although you can see the whites in his eyes because of the way I've drawn the stamp, I'm still going to put a little bit of white in each eye just to highlight it, and in case you've got any of the grey into that area. So, and then what I'm going to do, which I do quite often, just put some little white highlights on the cheek. I mean, you can go to town with white highlights. Bit of tissue on there. Let's get rid of that. Okay, you can do more white highlights if you want. You could do some white highlights around here with a Posca pen or a gel pen, but I'm not going to do that today. Not sure about his boot there. Let's just try and sort that boot out. So go back in with the darker blue again. That's the blueprint sketch, and just blend it there. And again on this side. And then I'm going to go back in with the grass. So this is not watered down in the same way as it was before, and I'm just going to put in some stronger colour around his boot, and then just take a damp brush and just blend it into the rest of the green. I'm going to actually go back in with a little bit more green just around here. Okay, and one thing that I've forgotten is I'm just gonna use some blueprint sketch to match his wellies. Just gonna paint in those bits of the letters just to bring it all together. I think another key thing with colouring is not to use too many different colours. So I try, if I can, to use similar colours throughout the image. So I've used the same colour here for the boots as for the letters. If you introduce it can be nice having lots of colours, but I tend to think a theme kind of really works and just follows that whole simple but effective rule. So I think that's pretty much it for now. I'm going to do some more with some different some more videos with different mediums at some point when I get a chance, but hopefully that just gives you a bit of an insight as to how I would colour one of my images. So it's not perfect, but it's effective for me. So thanks for watching, and see you again soon.